If communism and socialism are such inherently flawed and bad systems, why do Western countries work so hard to undermine them instead of letting them fail on their own? This would not be a better question for Ask Historians. However, I'll try my best with my poli-sci BA. Opposition to communism in terms of foreign and domestic policy is best understood by the doctrine of containment, reducing or blocking the growth of the Soviet sphere of influence. This policy is best explained in what's known as the X paper by Kennan, a US diplomat who coined the strategy. The X paper became a sort of declaration of Cold War, laying out the rationale for a policy of containment. This was highly influential as it provided an answer to the US government's anxiety about the Soviet Union post-World War II. To summarize Kennan's thesis, war between UK/US and the Soviet Union would be suicide. The US and its allies would not win a military victory. The Soviets have become illogical and not willing to cooperate, preferring a Russian-centered world order and viewpoint. 3. This viewpoint is inherently incompatible with the Western liberalism that underscores the US's system of government and trade. 4. Communism is the ideology the Soviets used to spread their sphere of influence. 5. Therefore, to survive as a nation, the US must beat the Soviet Union by combating the spread of communism. While still a military threat, isolating the Russian sphere of influence would make armed conflict highly unlikely. So in short, opposition to communism is best understood as opposition to Russian influence in world events rather than just a battle between economic systems. We could say something about the influence of big business on US foreign policy, but it would be overstated. As seen in Kinzer's All the Shah's Men, the UK and US at first rebuffed BP's plea to intervene to stop their oil fields from being nationalized. It wasn't until a spurious connection to the Soviets was invented did the US State Department take interest in Iran. You're simply confusing two very different ideas from the Cold War itself and the post-Cold War era. During the Cold War, basically no one thought that communism would fail the way it did. Everyone knew that communism was stable and would last indefinitely into the future, and that the USSR would converge with US living standards, making the USSR the largest economy on Earth by the beginning of the 21st century. The Warsaw Pact was militarily stronger than NATO, and it was widely understood that NATO relied on MAD nearly exclusively due to this understood disparity in military power. After the end of the Cold War, many people were completely shocked to see just how poorly the Warsaw Pact states were actually doing. This completely changed how the entire system was viewed. The conversation in academia became about how to transition these states to a new economic system. The classical Soviet-type economy was entirely and completely discredited. Some recent work has modified these criticisms with a focus on a post-60s malaise due to the fast growth in the post-war boom. Most economists would view the pre-malaise growth as being due to education and a very high level of investment. There is another way to view this. Were all these actions actually necessary? Did they actually make any sense? Those are far more difficult to answer. I suspect that they ultimately didn't shorten the Cold War or actually make any sense, hardly unprecedented in government policy. Maybe it was all a sideshow. Maybe the US interventions were completely and totally unnecessary. I would even suggest that most of the economic gains to the US from these actions have been overstated dramatically. I'm a bit of a novice on the topic, but how many of the issues revealed in Soviet states were actual issues with their economic system and not symptoms of the shock therapy treatment in the 90s? As far as I know, that era did a ton of damage to any legitimate progress made under the Soviet economy. The USA Eagle attempts to police the entire world. It is not just communists and socialists in its firing line. It is hard to even summarize the USA's foreign involvement as it is so expansive. Though here are some places to look. The hundreds and at one point thousands of military bases on foreign soil. See an incomplete list here. See a list of USA involvement in regime change. Funding international organizations. See an example here. Many of these organizations cover areas of the world globe showing Europe, Africa, which are nowhere near the USA mainland. The USA has the CIA, which according to itself is a specialist intelligence agency for foreign affairs. While it is hard to know exactly what it spends its money on, its budget is immense, being $52.6 billion in 2013. Which is 3.25% of the entire federal budget, using the official statistic of $1,617,515,199,604 at the time of writing this. So all in all, the USA is just involved in everything. Also, the other Western countries don't really initiate a whole lot in aggressive foreign policy these days. They just sometimes support the USA on its projects. I found reading the Jakarta Method to be quite eye-opening, with seeing how many jars the US has their hands in, and would recommend it to anyone who's also curious. I have a history degree and follow US politics frequently. If you want to understand why communism and socialism, but especially communism, are labeled bad in Western countries, you need to look into the Red Scare and Red Purge after WW2. It affected a number of countries quite significantly, and actually resulted in the collapse of a quite functioning socialist society in Japan. While it's mostly labeled as a response to Russia, it was really a ploy used by the right to create a foothold in American and Japanese politics. Interesting stuff. Another answer is imperialism. It's easier to control other places if we can put in our own dictators. The banana republics. Bananas are kind of a good example. Cuba. My opinion is that they aren't inherently flawed. We see them executed to some degree with universal healthcare and safety nets. The West, primarily the US nowadays, prefers to undermine them in other countries because it gives them control. You don't want your territories voting you out, lol. While not inherently flawed, we can be honest and say communism is always basically a dictatorship whenever it gets implemented. Which is inherently flawed, as the groups who want to install communism usually overlap with dogmatic political beliefs, which often lead to widespread purges and suppression of freedoms to hold power. So while more flawed in concept, the realistic execution of communism is flawed. This is, frankly, way oversimplified. It was really a ploy used by the right to create a foothold in American and Japanese politics. I really dislike pointing to singular narratives like this. It's very tempting and usually wrong. This may be one reason, sure, but it eschews a lot of other critical context. The Soviet Union represented a real and imminent threat to Western society, at least in the minds of Americans at the time. Your take is dismissive of this. I am also not a historian, so take my thoughts for what they're worth. A system that is difficult to execute correctly is, in my opinion, inherently flawed. I don't think this was necessarily obvious a century ago, as many bright people truly believed in communism, but surely we've gathered enough evidence to the contrary by now.